Welcome to Mountain Roots. I'm Josh, and this is the 30th episode in my Exploring Appalachia series. Thanks for joining me on the journey. Today, we'll head to Burke's Garden, Virginia, which is located a little more than 10 miles from the town of Tazewell. On the way to this almost otherworldly mountain valley, I spot a sign telling the harrowing story of Thomas Ingalls, once a resident of Burke's Garden, and a former Shawnee Indian captive himself. If you aren't familiar with who he is, not to get too heavy at the start here, but I'll give you a little backstory as I travel over the mountain to reach Burke's Garden. His mother was Mary Draper Ingalls, who maybe you've heard of, an early pioneer and settler to the western frontier of Appalachia here in Virginia. In 1755, she and her two young sons were taken captive by the Shawnee after a massacre during the French and Indian War. Mary was able to escape with another woman, and they spent months trekking nearly some 500 or 600 miles through Appalachian backcountry wilderness, crossing creeks, rivers, and mountains. But her two sons were not so fortunate. Mary's son George died while in captivity, but Thomas Ingalls, who was the tender age of 4 years old when taken captive, was later ransomed and returned to Virginia nearly 13 years later. It took several years for him to rehabilitate and learn English because he could only speak Shawnee upon his return. Thomas would later serve as a lieutenant in Lord Dunmore's war against the Shawnee in 1773. Afterwards, he married and settled in Burke's Garden, Virginia. But tragically, this poor guy just couldn't seem to catch a break, and in 1782, his wife and 3 children were kidnapped by Indians who raided Burke's Garden. Thomas was able to mount a rescue, but in the process, his 2 older children were killed, and his wife was tomahawked, but survived because Thomas rescued her and their youngest daughter. You have to get the perspective of someone living nearly 300 years ago to fully appreciate and understand such tales. Place yourself in their shoes for a moment. Appalachia was the backcountry wilderness, and this remote place I'm exploring today was the frontier in the early to mid-1700s. This reality discouraged permanent pioneer settlement until the 1800s. Burke's Garden is a topographically rare and elongated basin that's rimmed entirely by the Garden Mountain. Driving into this bowl-shaped valley will immediately convey the uniqueness of this place. Some think of it as a crater, and others suppose a mountain collapsed in on itself as the limestone beneath gave way, which is actually what happens to karst landscapes that are so prevalent in Virginia. They can be worn away from the top or dissolved inside the rock from a weak point. Sitting more than 3,000 feet above sea level, Burke's Garden is Virginia's highest valley, and there are 2 small gaps that naturally drain the roughly 5 by 10 mile, 33,000 acre Garden of Eden, as some call it. Others have referred to it as a real-life Narnia, and from an aerial or satellite view, it does look like it could be God's thumbprint. In fact, so desirable was this garden spot of the world that in the late 1800s, the Vanderbilt family tried negotiating a purchase of land from local farmers in order to build a large estate here, but no one was willing to sell. So, the Vanderbilts instead built a little place you may have heard of in Asheville, North Carolina, called the Biltmore Estate. Exploring Burke's Garden today is quite the delightful and charming experience. You see, here in the Appalachian backcountry, you'll find a growing community of Amish families. They farm and operate businesses here like the Burke's Garden General Store. The Amish are shrewd agrarians. They know good and fertile land when they see it, and due to the deep limestone soils here, combined with the high-altitude sweet grasses, which are high in Brix content, that's sugar for those of you who don't know, and an average yearly temperature of only 50 degrees, it causes the forage to be highly palatable for cattle and livestock year-round. This makes it easier for them to gain weight, and it makes farm life here feasible. From what I can find, somewhere around the 1990s, a small number of Amish families moved to Burke's Garden, but were unable to purchase enough land to attract other Amish families to form a viable community here. Today, however, they've returned with a thriving community of nearly 100 or more people. Speaking of just how fertile this beautiful cove really is, Burke's Garden was named after Irishman James Burke, who discovered it while following elk on a surveying expedition to the region in the 1740s. As the tale goes, Burke's either discarded or planted some potato peelings here while he was cooking, and sometime later on a return trip with another group camping at the same site, they discovered a bumper crop of potatoes, resulting in the area becoming known as Burke's Garden. Burke would later build a cabin nearby and live here in the mid-1750s until hostilities broke out during the French and Indian War. The Burke's Garden Elementary School is now used as a schoolhouse by the Amish, and they also hold fundraiser dinners here in the community. If you were wondering, these aren't Lancaster or Ohio Amish. No, these hail from western Kentucky. Not only is Burke's Garden Virginia's highest valley, but it's also Virginia's largest rural historic district. And if you don't blink, you'll also spot Virginia's smallest telephone company. Each year, a fall festival is held just up ahead, as well as the annual Varmint Half Marathon and 5K. And if you're wondering about that name, it comes from an old story in the 1950s when some kind of unknown creature was terrorizing local farmers by eating their livestock. Imaginations ran wild on what it could be until the men hunted the varmint down and discovered it was actually a large coyote. Today, the old post office serves as a thriving artisans guild where visitors can find beautiful quilts, woodworking and handcrafted furniture, paintings, and a remarkable variety of craft works from local artisans and creators. Following James Burke's discovery of the valley, German immigrants made it a backcountry frontier outpost as they came to settle here in the late 1700s. Some of their descendants still live in the valley to this day. Burke's Garden Central Lutheran Church and Cemetery are both on the National Register of Historic Places. The cemetery was founded around 1827 and the church was built in 1875. It served as a union church for multiple denominations, but Lutheran being the predominant one in modern times. This is likely because the German-Lutheran connection, since Germans account for a large percentage of the global Lutheran population, and you can find numerous sandstone Germanic gravestones here. Years later, an invasion of Burke's Garden by Northern forces during the war between the states occurred when Union troops looted horses and food, which resulted in both disease and very lean years in the garden. But by the 1890s, the population grew to nearly 1,500 people living in the valley, the most in its history then or since. Farming expanded and property became available as livestock exports to England became very profitable, but many would eventually leave once the agricultural revolution of mechanization happened. The Appalachian Trail can be accessed from Burke's Garden, and a place my pawpaw used to hunt known as Beartown Wilderness, which boasts one of the highest peaks in Virginia, sits to the southwest of the valley. My mountain roots go deep here, and since I have both Native American and German ancestry, I treasure the fact that not only did my pawpaw used to hunt abundant wildlife in this wilderness, but Native Americans before him also used this as a hunting ground. If you remember what I said about cool climate and good grass here producing some of the best cattle, well, this encouraged many to keep or invest in land here for growing beef. And I learned at Freddie's Barbershop in my Tazewell episode, which if you haven't watched that episode yet, be sure to watch it after this one. But Freddie told me that John Wayne, the John Wayne, would visit Burke's Garden, where his 26-bar ranch manager and Burke's Garden native, Marvin Meek, lived and raised cattle. Wayne's 26-bar herd under Marvin's management was one of the top in the United States. In fact, in 2011, Marvin and his wife Ella were inducted into the Hereford Hall of Fame for their nearly 60 years in the cattle industry, raising some of the finest Hereford cattle. Well, I've made it to Maddie's place. I'm going to head inside and see what kind of food I can get. I hope you've enjoyed this trip around Burke's garden today. If you did, let me know in the comments below this video. Give it a thumbs up, share it with somebody you know, and if you want to help me continue exploring Appalachia, sharing its history, and telling its stories, consider becoming a channel member on YouTube or a monthly patron at our Patreon page. I'll leave a link to that in the description of this video. As always, guys, thanks for watching this, and we'll see you in another episode.